unnecessary destroy media narratives of George Samueli. It is now 9:09 p.m. in a very dark, grim, sunless, lightless, dayless Budapest. Um, it's it's beyond words to describe just how dismal this time of the year is. But on a positive note, thank you everybody who has joined me for the live stream. I really appreciate it, despite the gloomy prognostications that I see something like Essie Dillendon, immediately I see his message there saying, rebuking me for something. It says, Mr. Samueli rudely ignores Sidney Lumet's Before the Devil Knows You're Dead, um, 2007, typical myopia of the media. What makes you think I ignored it? I mean, I haven't ignored it. I mean, Sidney Lumet was never my favorite film director, but I have used, when some of the movie polls, I have used Lumet's movies, but no one ever seems to vote for them. But anyway, the big news of the day, the big news of the hour, is the ceasefire deal between Israel and Hezbollah. So it seems like there's a deal in the works. The full details not immediately clear, but something of the nature of an Israeli withdrawal from Lebanon, for all of the territories that it's occupied, over the next 60 days. And I guess Hezbollah will withdraw from all areas south of the Litani River, and they will be those positions will be taken over by the Lebanese army. So, obviously, ceasefires are good. However, one has to keep in mind that the reason why there isn't a ceasefire in Lebanon has been that Hezbollah, quite nobly, but by and large fairly ineffectively, has tried to provide support for Hamas in Gaza. So from October the 8th, 2023, Hezbollah has been shelling Israel in a gesture of support for Hamas, or for the Palestinians. I mean, I shouldn't just say Hamas, but for the Palestinians, and which nobody else has done. So, but Hezbollah has done it, and of course, it's paid a considerable a price for it, because of course Israel has launched quite vicious attacks on Hezbollah, eliminating most of its leadership, assassinating its top leaders, including Hassan Nasrallah. And Hezbollah clearly is a shadow of the force it once was. Now, there's a lot, of course, there's a lot of talk. Hezbollah has all these missiles and so on and so forth. But the fact is that Hezbollah has decided to opt for a ceasefire. Hezbollah has decided not to continue with its support for the Palestinians. Understandable. And obviously Hezbollah is no match for Israel, contrary to these wild statements that you get on the alt media, how Hezbollah is just going to crush Israel, just like Iran's going to wipe Israel off the map, and so on. It's not. None of it is true, of course. We saw how easily Israel was able to penetrate Hezbollah, how easily it was able to wipe out Hezbollah's top leaders with a fairly rudimentary method, putting in explosive devices into these into pages and then walkie-talkies, and then assassinating their kind of sterling, or their charismatic and famous leader Hassan Nasrallah. So Israel was able to do that, and Hezbollah, which there it was. I mean, the one party in the Middle East that has stood up for the Palestinians, was ready to take risks on behalf of the Palestinians, really has had to call it a day. And yes, I mean, they love missiles, and yes, something like 60, 70, 80,000, I don't know how many Israelis have to move from from the territories where they were residing in northern Israel. But doubtless, I mean, if the ceasefire holds, they will return. Now, if you look at this, you say, well, Israel got what he wanted. I mean, what was the most important thing for Israel was not to wipe out Hezbollah, which would be a very difficult undertaking, particularly as they're still in Gaza. What was most important for Israel was that the shelling stopped. And again, the shelling was done for the sole purpose of expressing solidarity with the Palestinians. So once that's gone, then basically, Hamas or the Palestinians are pretty much on their own. I think they've been pretty much on their own through most of their history. But that after October the 7th, the only allies they had was Hezbollah. So that's come to an end. Now again, I fully expect that when we get to listen to the alt media, all the various characters who pontificate away, they will tell us tomorrow, doubtless, that this was a fantastic victory for Hezbollah, and Israel has been dealt a crushing blow. Except, of course, there's no evidence for it, as always. when it comes to alt media, there's just simply no evidence for that this was a crushing defeat for Israel. So naturally, the Biden administration is taking victory laps, and the Blinken has been on, and now at some time during this live stream, Biden will be delivering a triumphalist address or a news conference. I'm not sure what he's going to do. So yeah, that's as usual. Of course, whenever there's a ceasefire, Israel managed to land its customary blows into Beirut, killed the enormous number of people, but that's what Israel does. Few hours before the ceasefire, let's see how many people we can kill. And in the meantime, of course, the war in Gaza continues, and again, it's not really a war. It's essentially Israel creating conditions to ensure that life is impossible in Gaza. I mean, that's more or less what it is. I mean, there's no war. There's no war between Israel and Hamas, and that's why it's so. I find it so strange again, the people in the alt media who say, oh, genocide, Israel committing genocide, Israel, genocide, and at the same time they say that Israel is losing this war. I'm not quite sure how Israel can be both perpetrating genocide and losing the war. I mean, that just doesn't really make sense. I mean, it's when you have somebody at your mercy, complete mercy, that you can commit genocide. If you're losing a war, then you already aren't committing. You're not really in the position to commit genocide. The truth is, of course, that they're not waging a war. They're ensuring that life is impossible in Gaza. They want the Palestinians to go. They want them to leave. They want to make life as intolerable as possible. Hamas is no rival or threat whatsoever to Israel. It just isn't. It invaded on October the 7th, and within hours, it was driven out of Israel. That was it. I mean, they did the the land. It never occupied any land within Israel. It was driven out within hours. So by the end of the day, there were no Hamas fighters inside of Israel. So everything that's happened since then has nothing to do with any kind of a war, because they'd already been driven out. They'd already been defeated. So what's been happening since then has, of course, been the policy that Israel has attempted for ever since it came into possession of Gaza in 1967, which was to make life as intolerable as possible in Gaza and in the West Bank, in order that the mandatory Palestine, which Israel believes belongs to them, in order to make mandatory Palestine the state of Israel, the greater Israel. So they have to drive out this, the final remnants, final population remnants of mandatory Palestine. I mean, they drove out quite a considerable number, but some remained in the West Bank, in the Gaza, and that's what Israel has been trying to achieve for many, many years. So that's what they're doing in Gaza, and you just have to say, at some point they will achieve some successes. It's very difficult for them because so far Egypt and Jordan have have not accepted any Palestinians on their territory. So the plan to push Palestinians into the Sinai has not worked. Israel has tried. Israel has attempted, and as has the United States, they've attempted to cajole Egypt into accepting Palestinians in the Sinai, and of course that has not worked so far. But that's what's going on in Gaza. I mean, there's no war going on between Israel and Hamas. I mean, there really isn't any Hamas. I mean, it's just it's just an attempt to make life as intolerable as possible. So that's why all the talk about a ceasefire is kind of renders pointless, because there's no reason for Israel to pursue a ceasefire. I mean, the only reason might be just to get the hostages back, and then they can resume the usual policy in Gaza. But Hamas isn't going to, or whatever remains of Hamas, they're not going to give the hostages up, even if the hostages are still alive. Since the hostages are really the only bargaining chip that they have. So that's so while the Biden administration is now claiming that, well, now we've got the ceasefire in Lebanon, now we're going to push for a ceasefire in Gaza. Well, that isn't going to happen, and so that's out of the question. Now, of course, it may be that Israel is thinking that they'll get a good deal from Trump, and given how pro-Israeli the Trump people are, how they can help out Trump, by let's say they go to Egypt, and that Trump would be able to work out some kind of a deal with Sisi of Egypt and say, hey, take the Palestinians into the Sinai. I don't think it's going to work, but it's quite possible that is what Trump will try to do. Trump that he will try to do what Blinken failed to do, which was to cajole Sisi into accepting Palestinians. Trump may go for it. I don't think it's going to succeed. Because I don't see any upside at all for Egypt. Because Trump could offer a shitload of money to Egypt, and Egypt is an economic basket case. So he might well say, hey, this is quite nice, this money that you're offering. But the problem with receiving a lot of money is that sooner or later that money is going to be used up, and then Egypt has this huge problem on its hand. It's got hundreds of thousands of Palestinians filled with rage, and desperate to resume the fight against Israel. In which case, Egypt will be in the crosshairs of Israel. And that's something that Egypt really doesn't want to do. I mean, it wasn't happy at the time before the Camp David Accords, when Egypt was the leader of the anti-Israel movement in the Middle East. Egypt wasn't very happy with that. Sadat moved Egypt out of that column, and I don't think Egypt wants to get back in, because that's what would happen. If you have these hundreds of thousands of Palestinians, they will want to exact revenge on Israel, and that means that Egypt will be in Israel's crosshairs, and I don't think that Sisi wants that. But I fully expect that that's what Trump will try to do. So when Trump and his team talk about finishing the job, Israel has got to deal once and for all with the Gaza issue. Something of this nature will be uppermost in Trump and Trump's people in mind. Hey, can we actually get this the Palestinians out of Gaza? Can we just sort of denude it of its population, and then we hand over the northern part of Gaza to Israel, and then they can do whatever they want, build hotel resorts or whatever. So yeah, I mean that's quite likely. The other issue, of course, is what's happening in Ukraine. So if you recall, when we did the live stream last Thursday, that was just a few hours after President Putin had delivered his address to the nation, and he had announced that Russia had developed a new hypersonic intermediate range ballistic missile, and that he had launched this missile, which could be MIRVed, the multiple independently targeted reentry vehicles. So you got basically one missile, but a number of different little warheads on that missile, so they can hit. So one missile can hit many different targets, and therefore made them very difficult to, always have been very difficult for anti-ballistic missile systems to defend against. Anyway, so he said we have this, and we use that against an arms factory in Dnipropetrovsk, and this is, we consider, and these are really devastating. None of the Western anti-ballistic missile systems are able to cope with this with our new intermediate range missile, and we consider this was his dramatic announcement. We consider that any state that provides missile technology and missile technology weapons to Ukraine are legitimate targets for Russia. He'd never said anything like that before, because he made clear that now that the United States had removed all restrictions on Ukrainian use of the ATACMS, and Britain had removed all restrictions on the use of its Storm Shadows. And then, of course, some days later, but not at that time, on last Thursday, some day later, the French also said no restrictions on the Scalp missiles. So it says that, and because Ukraine cannot use them, because they require satellite technology, they require satellite guiding systems in order to guide them to avoid Russian anti-missile defense systems. So they need this satellite guidance so they can actually hit their target without getting shot down by the Russians, because they need all of that NATO expertise to inside Ukraine, and NATO expertise to ensure that they hit the targets inside Russia. Because of all that, essentially, NATO is at war with Russia. NATO is attacking Russia, and of course, as we'd already known this for a long time. There was nothing really startlingly new about that. Putin had made this announcement about the ATACMS and how NATO is essentially hitting targets inside Russia. In September, he just reiterated it this last Thursday. But his threat that he now regards countries, NATO countries, that provide weapons to Ukraine as legitimate targets, or in other words, military installations in those countries are legitimate targets for Russia. That was new. He never said anything as explicit as that. But we knew that the attacks, for instance, by Ukrainians against the Russian Black Sea Fleet, particularly the sinking of the Moskva, we knew that Ukraine hadn't done it. We knew that it was the British who were behind this. We knew that Ukraine's attack on the Kerch Bridge was basically the British did that. And of course, we know that all of these attacks by Ukrainians using their drones are, again, they use NATO targeting. Ukraine doesn't have the capability to launch drones to hit oil refineries thousands of miles away, oil refineries somewhere close to the border with Kazakhstan. Ukraine can't do that. There's only if the NATO essentially provides the guidance systems and provides all the satellite technology. So the targeting is being done by NATO. NATO is attacking Russian territory and, of course, killing Russians. So we knew this. Great, that was a fantastic for Putin to declare this. But the whole point of issuing a threat like that, of course, is that you follow through on that threat. I mean, if you say, well, if you do this again, then you're really gonna be sorry. Then naturally, the hoped for effect will be that the person's going to say, well, I'm not going to do that again because I don't want to be sorry. But if the person then goes ahead and does it again, after having been warned not to do it, then you will expect that the threat will be fulfilled. That, he said, well, I said you're going to be sorry. Well, now you are going to be sorry. But that hasn't happened. So over the past few days, we're getting more and more reports of Ukraine using ATACMS and Storm Shadow missiles on Russian territory. So we heard that that Ukraine has attacked the S-400 missile defense systems in Russia, and we've heard that Ukraine has attacked airfields using ATACMS inside Russia. And though the claim is that they were shot down or whatever, but Russians admitted yes, some of them were shot down, but some reached their target. Now the question arises: well, what's Russia gonna do about this? I mean, if you're gonna issue a threat, you really have to go through with it. You can't just simply say, well, yeah, I know we said that you're going to be sorry, but we say a lot of things, and I mean, it doesn't mean we're going to do anything. But so far, nothing. No, nothing from Russia. Now the problem is that it's possible that Russia will again respond by going with this Oreshnik missile and hitting a target inside Ukraine. They'll do what they did last week, when maybe not again on Dnipropetrovsk, but again some other target inside Ukraine. But that won't be a satisfactory response, because we know that Russia can hit Ukraine. I mean, we're not, and he's been doing it fairly consistently for almost 3 years, bombing Ukraine on a fairly regular basis. Not terribly effectively, but nonetheless, it's been bombing on a regular basis. What we've been waiting for, and why it was so important, was that Russia will make NATO pay. And that's really the heart of this. And it obviously the heart of this, because first of all, Russia has claimed we are in an existential war with NATO. I think that is a correct assessment. And that was the assessment essentially that Putin delivered on February the 24th, 2022, when he launched the so-called special military operation, which itself was very baffling, because if you have an existential fight, then you want to put all your resources in. Why would you want a special military operation if it's an existential fight? But okay, he did that then. But the problem is that if you keep thumping Ukraine, well, that's it. They attacked us with ATACMS. NATO provided ATACMS. NATO targeted ATACMS. So we're going to hit Ukraine. But that really isn't the issue. As we know, and as the Russians have said, and as everyone has said, this is a proxy war. NATO is using Ukraine as a battering ram to weaken, degrade, humiliate, destroy, divide, dissolve Russia. It's a golden opportunity. This is an opportunity like this comes along once in a few centuries for the West. So therefore, there's only one sensible course for Russia, which is to retaliate against NATO, and then to turn around to NATO and ask, well, are you really prepared to go all the way? Are you really prepared to get involved in a shooting war with Russia leading up to on the escalation ladder towards an exchange of nuclear weapons. And because if all Russia's going to do either do nothing or launch some more missiles against Ukraine, then NATO is just simply going to up the ante. I mean, we know this is exactly what NATO has been doing since February 2022. You know, at each step, they provided something to Ukraine, and then they watched the Russian response. They were very wary initially of doing too much for Ukraine because they really didn't know how the Russians would respond. You know, people who had grown up in the Cold War, you know, had learned. You know, you don't want to mess with the Soviets. You know, they, you know, remember what they did to the Wehrmacht. You know, we just, you know, they're just gotta stay the hell away from them. So they did this. So they start off with Trump started off in 2018 with the Javelin missile, anti-tank missiles, and then gradually, sending in, howitzers and Abrams tanks and then Patriot missile defense systems, F-16s, cluster munitions. Step by step, upping the ante, and each step of the way, they would watch and wait. What's Russia going to do? And then when they see that Russia's not going to do anything, then they say, well, okay, well, let's step it up a notch, because Russia doesn't seem to be responding. We all thought Russia would respond. They didn't. So now we got this point where, you've reached, a situation which Putin tells the world, hey, NATO is at war with Russia, and NATO is killing Russians on Russian soil. And we're not going to take this anymore. We're going to hit, we didn't say we're going to hit, but we now consider military installations on NATO territory, on the NATO countries' territory, those NATO countries that are assisting Ukraine, we regard them as legitimate military targets. So then, when we spoke last Thursday, I thought, good, well, now we've got a change has taken place. But it doesn't look like a change has taken place, not so far. And if all Russia does in response to the fact that they gave this warning, and remember, what's really interesting about this warning is the West response. The West basically said, we're not interested. I mean, they didn't take this warning very seriously, because the execrable Keir Starmer said, we'll continue with what we're doing until Ukraine wins, which, that's way more extreme than even Biden has ever said, that we're going to just continue to support Ukraine until Ukraine wins. But the French, who hadn't said anything last week, the French turned around and said, we're, the Scalp missiles, we're going to remove the restraints on that. So the response of the West was really, we're not very impressed. At the same time, we've had no real response from the Trump team, beyond the kind of fairly empty bluster from Donald Trump Jr., who I think is just there to keep the MAGA base happy, even as Trump is hiring all these neocons. But very significantly, and this is what we talked about yesterday with Peter on the live stream, the New York Times ran this story in which, buried somewhere in the towards the end, they're saying, well, the Biden people, along with European officials, have been discussing providing nuclear weapons to Ukraine. Whoa, whoa! I mean, that just said that. Nuclear weapons to Ukraine. So now, in the first place, if you give nuclear weapons to Ukraine that Ukraine itself can use, with Ukrainian fingers on the trigger, that would obviously be in violation of the Non-Proliferation Treaty. Ukraine is a member of the is a signatory of the Non-Proliferation Treaty. So that means America would be in violation of the Non-Proliferation Treaty. So one has to assume that what was being discussed is that nuclear weapons would be stationed on Ukrainian territory that that will be under American control, and that with a view, therefore, that they would be used in the event of a Russian attack. But of course, as we know, it's not difficult. If you can provoke a Russian attack. Listen, the Americans are masters of this. The Americans long ago mastered the art of provocation. This war in Ukraine was a masterclass in provocation. The step by step, they increase the pressure on Russia, knowing that at some point Russia will snap and do something. And that's what the Americans were doing. So in the same way, when they say that if there is indeed some kind of a ceasefire or an armistice signed between Russia and Ukraine, Russia and NATO, well, one of the key ingredients of such a ceasefire would be that that the Americans will continue to provide for enormous quantities of military hardware to Ukraine, to the point where Ukraine would just be sinking under the weight of all this military hardware, and on top of that, nuclear missiles. And of course, with a view 5, 10, 15 years down the road of provoking another confrontation with Russia. Because of course, if there's to be something like a partition of Ukraine along the lines that have been floated, which is that you've got NATO land, the NATO occupied Ukraine will be 80% of the territory. Russia will have taken 20%. But that 80% is going to covet that 20%. They're not going to accept the loss of that 20%. And so therefore, you're just simply preparing the ground for another war. And that's just looking at it in a more optimistic way, that there actually will be a ceasefire or an armistice, which I'm by no means convinced that there will be. But what's interesting was that in that New York Times article, which said, oh, well, they've been discussing passing on nuclear weapons to Ukraine, it barely caused a stir. There was no outrage, no politicians, no one in Washington expressing indignation. That what the hell are you doing? I mean, are you serious? You're planning for a nuclear war in Europe? I mean, it's just there's nothing. Nah. So why does that happen? Well, what it happens is you float an idea. That's how the American policymakers have always done this. You float an idea, you dump the idea in the New York Times. That's your bulletin board. And then see how people respond. If people respond very negatively, then the idea is shelved. If there's no response, then say, let's do it. Why not? Now, when we get Trump in the White House, and knowing that Trump kind of regards himself as this tough guy, somebody who's tougher than Obama, tougher than Biden, I think he's going to like the idea of deploying nuclear weapons in Ukraine. And I think he's going to go to the Russians and threaten them with it, unless you agree to my peace plan. And we're going to give nuclear weapons to Ukraine. How do you like them apples? But in any case, you know, and as I've said before, I think what will happen when he does present his peace plan, and I do think he will present a peace plan along the lines of, you know, we take 80%. There's a ceasefire. You know, Russia will take about 20%, but Russia isn't even in occupation of that 20%, because you know, if we're talking about next February, March, April, whenever you know, this peace plan gets discussed and debated, I think it's very unlikely that Russia will be in occupation of all of the Donbass. We know it's occupying maybe about 2/3 of the Donetsk, about 98% of Lugansk, but Kherson and Zaporozhye, I think it's it's hard to know exactly what the proportion of that is, but they're certainly very far from occupying Kherson and all of Kherson and Zaporozhye. Certainly, Zaporozhye city and Kherson city are in the hands of Ukraine. Now, so you know, at that point, he'll have this peace plan. Ukraine will say no. Russia will probably say, well, you know, there are things here that are quite interesting. You know, maybe we can talk about, you know. But Zelensky will say no. Absolutely not. Now, this is the point where the alt media, the which we often kind of deride, will say, oh, that's the moment when Trump will push Zelensky under the bus. No, he's not. He's not going to push Zelensky under the bus. He's not just not going to do it. I mean, that, you know, he does. It's not. You know, he will consider, and all the people around him will consider, that this is what America's committed itself to. Ukraine is what we have committed ourselves to. You can't just simply abandon Ukraine or allow Russia to win. You can't simply allow NATO to lose. And in any case, why should we lose? We haven't lost. We haven't lost anything. We haven't lost a single life. Why should we admit defeat when we haven't been defeated? And so they say no. I mean, let's keep up the pressure on Russia. And so Zelensky will say no, and then the United States will blame Russia for the failure of the Trump peace plan, and then Trump will escalate against Russia, including the provision of nuclear weapons to Ukraine. So, you know, all the talk that somehow Russia will you know, on its way to victory, that Trump really wants to end this war. Trump really just wants to throw Zelensky under the bus. He just wants to work out a deal with Russia. You know, maybe, yeah, he's going to turn Russia against China. That's his real interest. He wants to go against China. He wants to use Russia, and then Russia will go along with this. These absolute nonsense, absolute fantasies, total nonsense, total, utter bullshit. He's not going to do that with Ukraine. Trump will not throw Ukraine under the bus. Trump will escalate against Russia. He's put together a war team, a very hawkish team. There are no voices there that will urge some kind of a peaceful accommodation with Russia. And oh, what about Tulsi? Well, I don't think Tulsi is going to make it. I mean, I have to be honest. I think of the three nominees who are, are in questionable status, which is Bobby Jr., Tulsi, and Pete Hegseth. Of the three, I think two of them aren't going to make it. I don't think Tulsi is going to make it, and I don't think Bobby Jr. is going to make it. I don't think the Republicans will support them. I think Hegseth is the one that will make it, because while the Republicans may not particularly like Hegseth, Hegseth, presses all the right buttons for them. The only thing they've got against him, ultimately, I mean, something that's disqualifying, are these allegations. But the allegations are pretty unconvincing. They, it's really a case of he said, she said with that woman. It's reasonable to infer that he went to this event, he gave a talk at this event, and there was this married woman. She was there with her husband. She naturally came on to him, or I don't know what came on to him. Whatever, they were having a good time, drinking cocktails and whatever. And she went to his room, and then of course, one thing led to another, and then she kind of realized, well, I got a bit of a problem on my hands. My husband is here with me. I've got to come up with a story for my husband, and hence the thing. Now, that's my reading. I can't be sure, but that's just my reading on the basis of the police report. The police basically decided they weren't going to prosecute. And of course, he settled the case with this woman, because it's a nuisance suit. I mean, that's what celebrities do. Woman alleges rape, sexual assault, or whatever. Rather than let her go to the media and blab about this, and this causes you a lot of embarrassment, and including loss of a very lucrative job, which is what he had at Fox News. You settle with a non-disclosure agreement. So I think he's going to make it, but I don't think Tulsi will, and I don't think Bobby Jr. will. Anyway, let's take a look at some of the comments from the Gagglers, the people who keep the hounds off my back, which is very important by contributing, because then I can live a safe life for a short time. But anyway, so Danaki, always good to see you, Danaki. Kedvesh George, so predictably, Ukraine fired yet another round of ATACMS. Yeah, that's what we talked about a moment ago. Destroying, ironically, an S-400 battery, the air defense system. When are we going to see ICBMs flattening NATO? As Xenon, no doubt, is already cheering on as if it had already happened. When is useless idiot Captain Sergei Obvious Lavrov going to point out how their assumptions from 35 years ago were once again proven right? We told you we were right again. Yeah, I mean, as I say, I mean, we haven't had the response. I mean, and what was striking is that that when Putin issued this dramatic threat in his address to the nation, the Western leaders were just very unimpressed. I thought, well, maybe they'll pause and think, well, hey, this is getting a little dangerous. It's moving a little too quickly into very scary territory. But they didn't do that. They said, well, we don't take any of this very seriously. Well, the reason they said that, well, not just because of the Putin's track record of issuing all sorts of red lines and threats that he never followed up on, but he uses this intermediate range missile, which presumably is quite expensive. I mean, that's a big um, missile, and it has its MIRVs and whatnot. And then he basically he has a blank on it. He doesn't even put any proper warheads on it. It's basically blanks. So he uses this expensive missile, to do no damage at all. He didn't do any damage in Dnipropetrovsk. So that's why they didn't take it very seriously. They said, "Oh yeah, well that's it. That's the best you've got." So that's why Keir Starmer said, "Yeah, well, this isn't going to change our policy." And then the French chimed in. Up until then, they'd been quiet. They said, "Yeah, yeah, Scalp missiles. You can do what you like with the Scalp missiles as well." So they didn't take it very seriously. Now, what's happened over the last few days, and that Russia hasn't done anything, will not have impressed the Western powers again, because they say, "Well, you said you would do something, you haven't done it." And even when you did it, even when you take this new missile, this intermediate range ballistic missile, you now use this, but you use it on Ukrainian territory. You keep saying you're at war with NATO, which you are, which is quite correct. You are, but you never use it on NATO territory. And this, of course, goes to the heart of what we talk about all the time. It goes to the heart of the whole Russian special military operation, which is Russians and Ukrainians are killing each other. I mean, again, we don't really know the scale of the losses on both sides. I mean, we can speculate, but it is speculation. But obviously, it's certainly in the hundreds of thousands of deaths on both sides. But the war is against NATO. NATO hasn't lost anyone. So when you talk about the Xenon, every time I read Xenon, they're always telling us this is how NATO is losing. NATO is suffering great losses. And you say, well, who's losing the hundreds of thousands of men? It's certainly not NATO. And that was so peculiarity. So he throws this missile at Ukraine, even though the point he was making in September. Again, he said this in September. So he didn't need another warning. He'd already issued this warning in September. That should have been it. That should have been the last word on the matter. You issue one warning, and then you act. The classic line, next time there'll be no next time. So he didn't do that. Then he said, "Oh, this is it. This is my warning." And then he launches this missile against Ukraine in Ukrainian territory. And then there's nothing on it. He puts a blank on it. There's a blank. So you wasted your missile. You didn't do any real damage in Ukraine. And of course, you didn't impress NATO, because they say, well, again, he doesn't do it. And let's not forget that nonsense that was being peddled by Xenon for quite a long time. You remember the bunker in western Ukraine that Russia had hit, and I don't know, they'd killed 500 NATO generals. I don't think it was 500. I can't remember how many NATO generals they were supposed to have killed. And this was repeated ad nauseum about how NATO is suffering these casualties. Look at all these NATO generals that had been killed. But of course, it was obvious from the start that this was a scam, a hoax, a fraudulent story, because if you kill a NATO general, there aren't that many NATO generals. We would know about it. General Hans Hansen, of the Bundeswehr, he's now dead. And so on, Monsieur General Francois, whatever, he's dead. So then we know, oh, well, look, all these NATO generals are suddenly dead. And they say, yeah, obviously this was a big hit from Russia, because there were no NATO generals were dead. And it was a hoax. It was a scam. But at least with the people who were presenting that scam, we're doing it with a certain view, which is the only way Russia can actually demonstrate that it's taking this war against NATO seriously is if it actually kills NATO personnel. As long as it just keeps killing Ukrainian personnel, I mean, no one's going to take it very seriously. Because, of course, NATO couldn't care less about Ukrainians. We know this. They couldn't care less. They're using Ukrainians as cannon fodder. And again, there's nothing new about that. I mean, everyone's known this from the start. So now, again, and every time we have this escalation, we have the Xenon crowd who tells them no biggie, nothing to worry about. This war is going really well, boom, really, really fantastically well. And then the story now appearing in the last few days is that the British and the French are talking about deploying troops in Ukraine. So again, let's have a good laugh about it. Well, how ridiculous. It's not going to happen. No. British and French, no way. NATO forces are going to be deployed in Ukraine because the Russians will just burn them alive. Well, nobody suggested, I haven't read any suggestions that the British and the French are going to be deployed on the front lines. That isn't really the issue here. They are going to be deployed behind the lines in auxiliary positions. They'll be providing support, engineering, maintenance, infrastructure building. These are all auxiliary tasks that they'll be doing behind the lines. It's very, very important work. But what's the effect of that? The effect of that is that Ukrainians will be able to, not do that kind of work, not do the kind of maintenance and behind the lines work, and then they'll have more personnel to man the front. Which, I mean, obviously it is an issue that Ukraine does have a manpower issue. It doesn't have as many human resources to draw on as Russia does, though it's basically equaled Russia. It has the same number of humans on the front lines as Russia does. So Russia hasn't been able to, because of its refusal to mobilize, Russia hasn't been able to use its greater manpower reserves against Ukraine. And that's what we all assumed, and what a lot of this high-fiving crowd say. Well, of course, Russia is 5 times the size of Ukraine, and therefore it has much greater manpower reserves it can call upon than Ukraine does, which is quite correct. But if you don't mobilize, then you don't have any greater manpower resources than your adversary. And Russia has not done so. So that's why the numbers on the field is pretty comparable. And that's why so many show all the talk about how when Russia takes this village or takes that village and there's great rejoicing, there's not much progress, because you only progress in war. You only progress if, when you capture this city or this transport hub or this military installation, you're able then to push your manpower and all your forces in. You seize the moment when you've broken through your adversary's front lines. You have to do it. You have to break through and then seize the additional territory. If you just keep going village by village, you're not getting anywhere. You're not going to win any war. You've taken another village, because at some point they can mount a counteroffensive and then take these villages back. Or they can just simply retreat and set up sustainable defense lines that you can't breach. So anyway, thank you, Danaki. I really, I love these, when you talk about Sergei obvious Lavrov, I think, God, I'd love to hear another lecture about the multipolar world. NKMRD, Merkel is live now. Is she's live, but no subtitles. She's giving an interview as opposed to Die Zeit. I read today on on I think it was on the RT side that the the German media have taken up the Elon Musk's derogatory comments about Angela Merkel because they say Angela Merkel, Musk attacks Merkel below the belt, because what had happened was that Musk had tweeted out, because and we talked about this on in our podcast on Sunday. We talked about this Angela Merkel's interview with Der Spiegel, and she had attacked Elon Musk and thought Musk had too much power and so on. And somebody had tweeted out Merkel's comment about Musk, and Musk had retweeted with the comment, "Who is this Angela Merkel?" Angela Merkel. Now, of course, Musk knew exactly what he was doing. So Angela Merkel, I don't need to spell out what a Merkel is. I can just, hence, and the German media, of course, picked up on this, and then they said, "Oh, Elon Musk is hitting Angela Merkel below the belt." So that's that. So I think I'll give it a pass as far as Merkel and Die Zeit. So anyway, Robert, very very good to see you, Robert. And Robert says, given the current state of affairs, thank you, Robert, for your generosity. Given the current state of affairs, I must confess to feeling at a loss for words. All that comes to mind is "Stop the world, I want to get off." Yeah. Well, the great thing is, and I guess I don't know. I don't want to say it's a great thing is, but it's because different people have different perspectives on this. Is that we don't live forever, so we have our particular lifespan, and so you feel like, well, however awful things are, well, it's going to be the next generation is going to have to deal with it. At least it's not going to be burdening me. That's a very gloomy outlook, but it's I'm a kind of gloomy person, so that's the way I look at it. But you're right. I mean, we're constantly looking for hopeful signs, and unfortunately, people believe what they want to believe. People persuade themselves of things that are patently absurd. That's again, it's a human impulse. And I think the case of Donald Trump is particularly apt, that people wanted to believe certain things about Donald Trump. They wanted to believe that he was this the savior, that things would really change, that somehow all the terrible things that we'd had to endure, particularly during the Biden years, and of course before that we had the 8 years of Obama, and how they basically had transformed America. So you have hopes that at last the good, decent America will reassert itself. So by magic, things will get will get better. Well, we've seen what Trump Trump was he's a very skilled salesman, and he's very skilled at reading a room. He knows how to read a room, knows which way the wind is blowing, and he knows how to tap into popular themes, tap into resentments, tap into public anger. He knows how to do it. And but it was always insincere. He's always been insincere, and we knew from his first term that he was insincere. What had, I think, changed was the Democrats had foolishly waged this this lawfare campaign against him. So just as it seemed like basically Trump will fade away into irrelevance, he was already, getting on in years. His presidency kind of ended in that the humiliation of January the 6th, and we'll see that will be the end of Trump. And then the Democrats decided to launch this nutty lawfare campaign against him, and suddenly he became a martyr. And he seemed, well, hey, this is so patently unfair. This is such a ridiculous misuse of the legal system, just in order to get someone, that people, people were drawn to him out of sympathy. Hey, this is unfair. So if they're really doing this to him, maybe he's doing something right. Maybe he's a good guy. Maybe he needs our support, because this is clearly so unfair. And not only that was this abuse of the legal system, but it was all being cheered on by the media. Even when you get something so stupid as some woman coming out saying that sometime in the mid-1990s, she had been raped by Donald Trump in Bergdorf Goodman, and the media pretended to believe the story. The courts in New York pretended to believe her. The jury, which just absolutely loathes Trump, pretended to believe her. Well, suddenly Trump seemed like a martyr. This is that he's being crucified, and I think that's what helped propel him to return to the White House. But all the rest, all the things that people have attributed to him, he's going to, he's a peace maker. He's going to bring these wars to an end. He's going to expend political capital. Making himself a very unpopular figure with the media, with the policy-making elite. Making himself, he's going to, bring this peace. He's going to bite the bullet. Don't do something that no one else had ever done. He's going to do all this. That's just nonsense. It's just wishful thinking. So that's the problem that we have, which is, and we have to accept it. It's like when I started saying about this Israel and Hezbollah. I mean, it's obvious that basically Hezbollah has been defeated, and it's been obvious for some time that Hezbollah is not in any position to continue to fight Israel. Israel is able to fight on two fronts, and has seen Hezbollah off. After all the talk of they got all these missiles, they can destroy Israel, and Iran can, of course, wipe Israel off the face of the earth, and all this stuff. It's just it's wishful thinking, and we just have to accept that really bad things happen in this world. Really, bad people prevail, and good people go under. And we're not exactly new or original in that observation. I think many people had observed this many times before us, but yeah, nothing good happens. Anyway, so on that melancholy note, but thank you, Robert, for your generosity. And NKMRD, he says, stream error for everyone. When she said their last words, as people in the chat confirmed, Zeit is so, it's such a disgrace. I have no words. Huh. Okay, I'm not quite sure I understand that. Stone River, thank you so much. Thank you for your generosity. Stone River says, George, can great men alter the course of history, or is it only historical forces that matter? Well, that's a very interesting question, and I would tend to think that, I mean, of course, you mean by it raises an interesting question. First of all, what is a great man? Because is a great man somebody who is both has a huge impact on the world and who is good, that he has good qualities, and that therefore he has an impact for good, or is a great man just simply someone who just has a huge impact? And that I think is a I don't know about the good men, whether good men can have a great impact. I mean, obviously, we have the founders of religion. We have Jesus. You'd have to say, from his teachings, from everything that we've read. I mean, he was clearly a good man who had a great impact. I mean, obviously changed the history. I mean, of course, people say will say negatively about Christianity, but without question, he was a great man and a good man who had a huge impact. But the point about the historical forces is that if one thinks of let's say historical events in recent times, then you would have to say that without strong, decisive, imaginative, ruthless leaders, movements would have failed, and then then the historical forces would have. You say, well, those are the historical forces, but for some reason, the historical forces did not work. And I'm thinking in particular of just as an example, of the Bolshevik Revolution. So, here's the Bolsheviks. There's a ragtag bunch who seized power in the dissolving Russian Empire. And, if you were thinking in terms of logic, you think, well, they're not going to be able to hold on to power. How the hell can this bunch prevail against all the forces that are arrayed against them? All the people who hate communism, who hate socialism, and certainly, they don't like a bunch of Jewish intellectuals ruling over them. But they prevailed, and they prevailed against all the forces arrayed against them in the Civil War. Who, again, who on paper would have been much stronger than the Bolshevik, all the whites. They prevailed against the interventionists, the Allied intervention, which tried to crush them, and then they held on to power. They held on power, and then they prevailed against the massive invasion from Nazi Germany. In any one of those things would have easily defeated the people who were in power in Russia. And you can say that's a bad thing. Again, that's why I asked, is a great man, is it somebody who has a huge impact? The Bolsheviks, nothing good to be said for them, but it just so happened that they were led first by an outstanding individual, which was Lenin, a total political opportunist, absolutely ruthless, and then of course by Stalin, and so they managed to prevail against much stronger forces. I mean, it could easily have gone the other way. Basically, Russia would have just dissolved, just broken up. Everyone had gone their own way. They would have just broken up. Not just all the sort of republics kind of created, have gone their own way, but even Russia itself would have just dissolved into individual republics. And then we say, well, that was inevitable. How could you possibly keep this huge empire in being, the one that it was created by Peter the Great and Catherine the Great and so on? How could you keep it? Of course, you go, that's inevitable historical forces. Of course, it broke up. How could it not? Or every empire breaks up, but it didn't. And somehow they were able to keep this together. And then eventually, you got mediocre leadership that took over once the great Bolshevik leaders disappeared. You had the mediocre leaders who took over, didn't really know how to run the place, and one mediocrity followed another until basically they got to Gorbachev, and then they just pissed the whole thing away. And now, in my more pessimistic moments, and I don't want to indulge this, we may be, moving towards another real total disintegration in Russia. And I mean, who knows which way it's going to go? So that's what happens when you have mediocre leadership. Then things real, just absolutely will collapse. When you have decisive leadership, it looks so easy, like they just had terror. They're ruled by terror. Well, no, I mean, terror doesn't really do it for you. That isn't going to be enough. You need something else. Terror would not have ensured the Red Army's victory over the Wehrmacht. No one else had been able to defeat the Wehrmacht until the Red Army. Terror alone isn't going to do it. And so, but again, you compare good leadership, decisive leadership. Maybe the cause may be very bad. I mean, I think Bolshevism, communism, I think those are very bad causes. But nonetheless, they were led by very effective leaders. And then what happened after? What happens when the effective leaders disappear? Then things go down the tube, and you get more and more mediocre leaders. And then, and we're in the situation now. That's why, if you talked about the present day, we had been led to believe that Putin was a very strong, a very effective leader. He had brought Russia back from the brink. Russia was on the brink of disintegration under Yeltsin. He brought pride, self-confidence to Russia. Russia now, a good, strong economy. Russia now had a strong, effective military. It was now respected and feared by the rest of the world. And therefore, if should anyone start messing with Russia, they will suffer the same fate as those who had tried to mess with the Soviet Union. Well, that hasn't really panned out. We'd been led to believe sort of in false ideas. So, my view is, just to put it, is leadership does indeed matter. Whether it's for good or for ill, leadership matters. You got, when you have an effective leader, then many things happen. When you don't, then only bad things happen. Anyway, thank you so much, Stone River. Thank you for your generosity. R. Brown says, history is not a force like a river, such that it has fixed course. It's simply the recounting of what transpired in the past. As such, history is largely driven by events occurring in real time and the decisions and actions made by humanity over a period of time. So yes, great man are the causal agent for the history we record as we look backwards. Changes in the course of history, certainly with regard to human interaction, are highly correlated with human agency and action. Well, I think so. I think it it makes leadership matters a great deal. And then when we write, as you say, when we write the history, then of course once we've had bad leadership, then we say, well, that was inevitable. Well, either way, I mean, historians will tend to present it in a way in which something was inevitable. But of course it wasn't, and what mattered was leadership. So you have accounts of the origins of the First World War, and the thrust of it is always, well, it's inevitable. It was inevitable that the great powers would come to war, but of course it wasn't inevitable. It was, very bad leadership, a perfect storm of bad, mediocre leaders, all present at the same time, that led to that disaster. And so So yeah, I mean, it's what what would have made the difference? It would have been, you could easily have gone the other way during the July crisis in 1914, if you'd had um, strong, decisive leaders who could have avoided it. Anyway, and we have Marty. Very good to see you, Marty. Thank you so much. Thank you for your generosity. And then Robert says, historical forces such as what Foucault termed the discourse of the state make possible a certain understanding, which implies the use of power in a certain way. An excellent book on the state is Der Staat, written by Franz Oppenheimer. If I could recommend only one book to Gagglers, it would be Der Staat. Der Staat serves as the intellectual framework for which the actions of state can be invariably hung. Franz Oppenheimer was a specialist on international law, and so that's well worth reading. But again, I mean, we get back to the key issue here, which is that obviously leadership matters, but there's a sense every time when you look back on the past that, well, of course, history had to have moved in that direction. But of course, so much of it depends on look at the case of the French Revolution. French Revolution, very reached great success with Napoleon, and then let's see with where he was able to lead France and what he was able to do with the ideas of the French Revolution, and then of course when Napoleon disappeared from the scene, France kind of disappeared from the scene. That was the last we heard of France for a long time. So there was the wars of the early 19th century, where France was really the terror of Europe, and then we had the next 100 years in which France kind of became a fairly insignificant force in world affairs. So but basically is leadership matters. Cynthia, always very good to see you, Cynthia. Thank you so much for your generosity. So Cynthia says, Ari, last night's movie, why was John Mitchell the first to take the fall for Watergate? Was Kissinger really a leaker? If so, what did he leak and why did he do it? How does the coup or assassination attempt of Castro have anything to do with the JFK assassination, as the film suggests? If so, did Nixon have any knowledge of it? And does the Pentagon Papers or the break-in of the Daniel Ellsberg psychiatrist's office fit in anywhere into any of this? So these are all excellent questions. I mean, to address the John Mitchell, the thing was about John Mitchell, he was the campaign manager of Nixon's re-election campaign in 1972. And what had happened was that the campaign had wanted to run its own intelligence operation as to what the Democrats were doing. But John Dean, who was the White House counsel's office, he ran the White House counsel office. He was basically the liaison between the White House and the campaign. John Dean had hired Gordon Liddy to come up with an intelligence plan for the 1972 campaign. And of course, Liddy came up with all sorts of nutty ideas about break-ins and blackmail and extortion, setting people up with prostitutes and so on. And Mitchell had turned it down. I think and asked him to modify this plan, and then Liddy modified the plan, but it was still outrageous. And Mitchell again told him not to do so. And then the third time, we have when Liddy again modified it, then Mitchell apparently had signed off on it. But it's not clear whether he had, because Mitchell, I think, insisted that he had never signed on to any of Liddy's wild ideas to gather intelligence. John Dean claimed that he had. Now, the problem was that John Dean was really at the heart of Watergate, and he was also the government's main witness against all the Watergate defendants. So we're relying very much on what John Dean claimed about Watergate defendants. So Mitchell was the first one who goes down because he was really the campaign manager. So if the campaign was involved in the break-in at the DNC headquarters of the Watergate Hotel, then obviously Mitchell was responsible. Now, Dean says his responsibility is more direct because Mitchell had signed off on Liddy's plan, for break-ins and all the wiretapping and all the rest. Mitchell denied it. Nonetheless, the government prosecuted him and got a conviction. But let's just keep in mind one thing, and something that wasn't really I would say it wasn't really written about at the time. This was in 1972. And that was that all of these prosecutions took place in Washington, D.C. Now, Washington, D.C., even then in 1972, was 95% Democrat, 5% Republican. So they got all these convictions, but they were basically convicting Nixon's people, essentially convicting Republicans. It's very much the same as what we have now, only now people are more aware of it. When you have the January the 6th people, and you got all the people who had worked for Trump, and of course they all get convicted. You get 100% conviction rate because you have a DC jury, DC courts, DC judges, DC prosecutors. So of course they're going to convict a Republican. Of course they're going to convict Nixon's people. I mean, only 5% of DC had voted for Nixon in 1972. I mean, he got an overwhelming landslide, but in DC, he only won 5% of the vote. So the fact that Mitchell and all the rest of the Watergate cast were convicted, it doesn't mean anything. They were convicted in the DC court. So that Dean claimed that Mitchell had signed off on Liddy's insane plan to run an intelligence operation against the Democrats. So that's why. So even when Dean is the one who's saying, "Oh well, he's going to have to take a rap," or he's basically, that there's perjury and everything, but Nixon really didn't know what the hell Dean was up to, and that's why in that famous March the 21st, 1973 conversation. If you follow it, and it's very difficult to follow because it's just basically it's a conversation where people are kind of digressing and they're talking one thing, then they go back to that, and then some of it is garbled, because the audio system really wasn't that great. But it's clear that Nixon really didn't know what the hell was going on. And that Dean had really orchestrated everything. He had really orchestrated the Watergate break-in. He had also orchestrated the cover-up in Nixon's name. And so Nixon was trying to extract from Dean what the hell has actually been going on, and indeed, what were the liabilities? What was Nixon's liability? What was the liability of everybody in the White House? Because after all, Dean was head of the White House counsel's office. But Dean, even at that time, was because he knew that he was in the crosshairs of the prosecutors. He was already planning on making a switch to become a government witness. So he was trying to figuring out whether he can get a better deal from Nixon, maybe a pardon, or should he seek a a deal with the government prosecutor. He decided eventually to get a deal with the government prosecutors. Anyway, to your next question, was Kissinger really a leaker? Yeah, Kissinger was. I mean, he was a leaker in the sense that he wasn't leaking classified information. Kissinger was just an inveterate gossip, and he was constantly talking to journalists. The journalists at the time, they were all in love with Henry Kissinger. I mean, Kissinger now has fallen into disrepute, but at the time, the journalists were in love with him. They regarded him as this genius, this foreign policy genius. He was Metternich, he was Bismarck, Richelieu, one of these great geopolitical minds. And Kissinger was very eager to have them say these things about him. And so, yeah, he was constantly talking to reporters, and they were constantly writing these slavish articles presenting him as a genius, but he was the source of the information. And Kissinger, in his leaks, presented everything as if he Kissinger was the architect of all of Nixon's foreign policy accomplishments, and Nixon was just simply going along with with Kissinger's ideas. But Kissinger was running the foreign policy, not the president. And the media were happy to write that because they detested Nixon, they despised Nixon. They couldn't really accept that Nixon was the architect of these dramatic foreign policy accomplishments. So they obviously, yeah, Kissinger, is a German Jew, Holocaust survivor, professor at Harvard. Of course, he's the one who's behind it. Can't possibly be somebody like Nixon, from Whittier, California. He can't be him. But of course, it was Nixon who was all of the big foreign policy accomplishments of the administration were all Nixon's ideas. The opening to China and so on. Now, the other thing about Kissinger as a leaker is that there were people leaking from the National Security Council. Kissinger was during Nixon's first term, he was the National Security Advisor, so he was in charge of the National Security Council. And then during his second term, he was both National Security Advisor and Secretary of State. So he had both positions. But there were people within the National Security Council who were really very opposed to Nixon's policy, and they were leaking. Now that Kissinger didn't like, because it's one thing for Kissinger to chat with reporters, but that was okay for him to do it. He was he ran the National Security Council, but he wasn't going to accept that people who were working for him, who were on his staff, would themselves be leaking stuff to journalists. And that enraged Kissinger. And so Kissinger wiretapped his own staff. He put bugs on his own staff to find out which of them was leaking. And of course, he did expose a number of them. This was really all very embarrassing for Kissinger, and that really began the slow decline of Kissinger's reputation when he came out that he had been bugging his own staff, listening into his own staff's conversations. So in his memoirs, he went through a long self-justification as to why he did that. Why did he wiretap his staff? Well, I wasn't violating anybody's privacy. We weren't really interested in their personal conversations. But we had to, because we were doing all these great foreign policy initiatives, and we couldn't have people leaking stuff. But that began his gradual descent, as far as the whole Super K idea that he was this great genius. So he felt that he had the right to chat with reporters. He didn't think that the people who worked for him had that same right, and so he instituted this wiretapping of his staff. What did he leak? He leaked. I mean, most of what he leaked was stuff about how he was the kind of the mastermind of the foreign policy. But there was one thing that he did leak, which was a little embarrassing, and that was at the time of the war between India and Pakistan. So what had happened was that East Pakistan, they I mean, basically you had after the partition of the Indian subcontinent, the kind of you had obviously India, and then you had West Pakistan, and then thousands of miles away you had East Pakistan. They were kind of on either side of India. But the problem, but again, the people in the West Pakistan were actually very different from the people in East Pakistan. The only thing they had in common was that they were Muslims. But the thing was that they spoke Urdu in West Pakistan, and then they spoke Bengali in East Pakistan. But anyway, they had an election in East Pakistan, and they elected this. I think it was, what was it called? I think it was called the Alawi League. I think it was no, maybe not Alawi League. It was Awami League. I can't remember. But anyway, the leader was this guy Sheikh Mujibur Rahman, and their program was basically we're not going to be forced to speak in Urdu. We want to be speaking Bengali anyway. So. And so it was basically a separatist movement. They said, hey, we do, we're Bengalis. And then, of course, Pakistan decided, in a very brutal way, decided to crack down on these Bengali separatists in East Pakistan. It was quite nasty. And this. It was Bhutto. It was Benazir Bhutto's father was kind of responsible for this brutal crackdown in East Pakistan. But the thing was that while the East Bengalis were Muslims, they were very, ethnically they were same as the West Bengalis in India. And so India got very upset about this, and then India intervened to stop this massacre of the East Bengalis, and then that led, of course, to basically India defeated Pakistan, and so that East Pakistan eventually seceded and hence became the state of Bangladesh. But anyway, the massacres were being conducted by the West Pakistanis. And Nixon and Kissinger basically decided, well, what we're going to do is we're going to support the West Pakistanis. Why? Because the West Pakistanis were allied with China. This was part of their whole policy of opening to China. And so that, in other words, since West Pakistan was allied with China, and India, which was now at war with West Pakistan. India was, of course, had historically been aligned with the Soviet Union. So that the Nixon said we're going to side with West Pakistan, the same West Pakistan that was carrying out these kind of brutal massacres in East Pakistan. This Kissinger leaked to the media, and this caused a lot of outrage about the famous kind of tilt towards Pakistan. So the Americans were tilting towards towards that the side that was supposedly carrying out the massacres. I mean, I think Nixon was making a very rational geopolitical calculation. I mean, he's saying, well, what's important for us is to keep in with China. And so, it's important for us to support West Pakistan against East Pakistan, because East Pakistan is allied with India, and India is allied with the Soviet Union. But that was leak that came out, that basically Nixon said we're going to tilt towards Pakistan. But so I mean, that's the most famous that I can think of, that in terms of what Kissinger leaked to the media. Now, the next question you say is, how does the coup or assassination attempt of Castro have anything to do with JFK assassination, as the film suggests? I tend to I don't think he does, and I don't think it has anything to do with Nixon. The only part of it that I think it does have something to do with the JFK assassination was that after the failure of the Bay of Pigs, which was very humiliating for the Kennedy administration. So they tried to overthrow Castro using the CIA organized a group of Cuban exiles who they organized this invasion of Cuba, but it was an absolute fiasco. And Castro was able to defeat this invasion very easily. But what the Kennedys did after that was then to plan for the overthrow and particularly the assassination of Castro. So this is April 1961, and so they now planning to assassinate Castro, and so they got the CIA involved in this. And then the CIA was like, well, how do we do this to assassinate Castro? So they got in touch with, the remnants of the mafia, many of them who had fled the Cuban Revolution, so the mafia who had run Cuba before Castro's takeover. So we had them, and they still obviously had their contacts in place in Cuba. So that was the plan was, well, how do we assassinate Castro? Well, we go to the mafia, the mafia characters who are still here in the United States, and ask them, in terms of their connection. That's hence this guy Johnny Rosselli, who comes up in that film. The Johnny Rosselli, he had been a kind of a mafia guy in Cuba. And so they were planning on to assassinate Castro. Now, Oswald had been he was a communist, very emotional. He had tried to go to the Soviet Union and defect. That's what I was thinking. Yeah, he tried to defect to the Soviet Union. He did so. The Russians were a little wary of taking him in, but they did allow him to defect to the Soviet Union, and then he came back, and he was really quite distressed about these Kennedy attempts to assassinate Castro, and then he went to Mexico City. This was just a few days really before the assassination. He went to Mexico City and tried to visit the Cuban embassy in Mexico City. I think, presumably, he wanted to offer his help to Cuba somehow to stop, the Kennedy plans against Castro. Now, he wasn't allowed to enter the Cuban embassy because Cuba, the Cubans in the embassy thought that this was a setup. That this was he was a agent provocateur. He was clearly being set up by the Americans. So they absolutely said, no, you can't enter the embassy. Then of course he went back and conducted the assassination. So the connection between the two is that Castro that Oswald was very distraught about the Kennedy plans to assassinate Castro. But the film, and this I think is really obnoxious, tried to suggest that Nixon was involved in these assassinations. And he was not involved in either of the Kennedy assassination. First of all, he wasn't involved in the Bay of Pigs. He didn't make any decisions about assassinating Castro. How could he? He wasn't in government at the time. That's why all these suggestions by Oliver Stone that somehow Nixon was involved. But how would he be involved? Even as vice president, you're not really involved in intelligence decisions. I mean, it's not. I mean, these are decisions taken by the CIA, people who have executive powers. But even then, so that only goes up to January 1961, when Nixon was at least involved in the Eisenhower administration, because the plans to invade Cuba, which culminated in the April 61 Bay of Pigs invasion, the plans to invade Cuba were hatched inside the Eisenhower administration. Nixon knew about that, but Nixon wasn't really involved. I mean, he's just the vice president. But after Nixon was out of power in January 61, Nixon had nothing to do with that. So the film suggests, he was involved in the Kennedy assassination. I mean, how would he? I mean, he was nothing at that time. 1963, he's nobody. He's just a practicing lawyer. And nobody thought in November 1963 that Nixon would ever return to power. So he obviously had nothing to do with that. And he didn't have anything to do with the assassination of Bobby. The film kind of hints at it, but there's just no evidence for it. And, it's all very dramatic that Nixon's at the center of this and Nixon's at the center of that. The truth is, and Oliver Stone just simply doesn't want to accept it, that his heroes, the Kennedys, were knee-deep in the anti-Castro plots. All these plots against Castro were hatched by the Kennedy administration. The overthrow and assassination of Ngo Dinh Diem of South Vietnam took place in the Kennedy administration. The assassination of Trujillo, that's also mentioned in the film. Trujillo took place under the Kennedy administration. The killing of Patrice Lumumba in Congo, Kennedy administration. So Stone doesn't really want to accept that because his heroes are the Kennedys. So he somehow wants to attribute this to Nixon. There's no connection to Nixon. Anyway, and then you ask about the Pentagon Papers and the break-in of the Ellsberg psychiatrist's office. The Pentagon Papers was kind of interesting because what had happened there, this was when Robert McNamara, who was defense secretary under Kennedy and Johnson, he left the Pentagon in 1967. But before he left the Pentagon, he had assigned this team to write a history of America's involvement in Vietnam. So, and Daniel Ellsberg was a member of this team. The team was run by Leslie Gelb, who then, he was head of subsequently became Council on Foreign Relations. He had a column in the New York Times. But Gelb led this team who would write this history. But the thing was that once McNamara had gone, no one really knew what was going to happen to this history. I mean, he had commissioned this work and put everybody on to write or work on this history, but no one really knew it. So they completed this history, and then they didn't know really what to do with it. And then Daniel Ellsberg basically started taking photographs. There's a huge history of taking photographs of these documents, and eventually, but you have to keep in mind the history itself. Really, it starts during World War II, and basically the French, who had been defeated by the Japanese, and then the resistance to the Japanese, which was led by the Vietnamese communists, Ho Chi Minh, and then subsequently when the Americans came in, and everything else. It was the history. So the history begins during World War II, the rise of the Viet Minh, the Vietnamese communists, and then it culminates. It finally ends in 1967. So long before Nixon came to power. And a lot of it is, of course, very damaging about the American involvement. Particularly damaging was the part about the assassination of DM. It goes into great detail, but the Kennedy involvement in the overthrow and assassination of DM. But anyway, so Ellsberg did all this. He photographed these pages, and then he passed it on to the New York Times. And of course, then New York Times published it. But this, and here's the kind of the strange aspect to it, which was the Nixon administration got very angry about this. Nixon wanted to absolutely stop this, even though this history in the Pentagon Papers really ends in 1967. So that again, 2 years before Nixon's return to the White House, and so, but he absolutely was furious about this. So they tried to prevent the New York Times from publishing the Pentagon Papers. But that the Supreme Court ruled against the Nixon administration simply on the grounds of the First Amendment. They said this is prior restraint. You can't do prior restraint. You can't stop a newspaper publishing the story. You can subsequently pursue litigation, against Daniel Ellsberg, because Ellsberg had obviously committed a crime. They said he was supposed to be highly classified, so he had basically violated Official Secrets Act, so they could prosecute him. But it was always going to be difficult to prosecute the New York Times. But anyway, the Nixon administration lost the case in the Supreme Court. The papers were published, and then this is where it becomes kind of interesting, because somebody within the Nixon White House, I don't think it was Nixon, but that has certainly never been proven, had decided that, well, we need to discredit Daniel Ellsberg. Ellsberg was being feted. He was kind of a hero in the media, even though he was facing serious criminal charges. And they turned to this plumbers unit that they had set up in the White House to stop the leaks. So this is where they had these leaks. Nixon and Kissinger were outraged by all the leaks that were coming from the White House, so they set up this thing called the plumbers unit. And the people who were involved in the plumbers unit was particularly this guy, E. Howard Hunt, and the people who then, a year later, showed up in the Watergate break-in. So the people who were in the plumbers unit were then seconded to the presidential campaign. When I was talking about this intelligence operation that they were going to run. So these people who had been in the plumbers unit in the White House, let's put them to use in the presidential campaign. So the people who broke in to Ellsberg's psychiatrist's office were then the people who were involved in the Watergate break-in. Now, I'm not sure, again, who exactly ordered the break-in to the Ellsberg psychiatrist's office, and I don't even understand what exactly that was supposed to achieve, because whatever there is in the in his discussions with his psychiatrist, why would anyone be interested in any of that? I mean, why would that be in any way discrediting of what Ellsberg had done? I mean, it was a strange kind of idea, but it was also strange because it was obvious that this was a criminal act that had been committed. So the claim is that this order to break into the Ellsberg psychiatrist's office was given by John Ehrlichman. And that may or may not be true. I'm not sure. But Ehrlichman was a lawyer. And if you're a lawyer, you would know that, hey, breaking into somebody's office, psychiatrist's office or anyone's office, that's a crime, and therefore you're in legal jeopardy if you're engaged in the breaking into this office. So, but the break-in was done by the members of this plumbers unit, this E. Howard Hunt, and the Cubans, and then they show up a year later in the break-in at the DNC headquarters and the Watergate. So that's the connection between Ellsberg psychiatrist, and then the and then the Watergate. The heart of it is this plumbers unit that was set up within the White House in 1970. And then Cynthia goes on. Another thing, George, what kind of proof is there that JFK and the Dems stole the 1960 election from Nixon? And is it possible that one of the many reasons why the Republicans broke into the DNC headquarters of the Watergate Hotel complex is that they could find more definitive proof of the stolen election by JFK and the Democrats? Well, the problem has always been, when you steal an election, it's actually very difficult to prove. I mean, you basically you come up with the graveyard vote. You suddenly here are the votes. The dead men walking. This is how they voted. So it's just awfully difficult, because then you basically you come up with you find these votes, and then they're gone. They're just they're thrown out. They're burnt and whatever. So it's always been extremely hard at anywhere to prove electoral fraud. I mean, unless you can actually film somebody stuffing a ballot box, putting in 10 votes instead of 1, it's very hard to prove. In the case of the 1960 electoral fraud, I mean, it's just simply now, even someone like Teddy White, who wrote all those famous books about the making of the president and making of the president in 1960, 64, 68. Even he acknowledged that obviously Mayor Daley in Cook County basically stole that election in Illinois. I mean, it's like, at any time when the votes are coming in, and then all right, we are, I don't know, 120,000 votes behind. All right, that's an awful lot. But let's say we are let's say we're 25,000 votes behind. Well, we're going to find 25,000 votes from somewhere. So they go off and find 25,000 votes. It's not hard to do, and the reason that's why election fraud is so easy to perpetrate, because it's just very you know what you have to do. You just go find the votes. And then you have you have all the people who count the votes. I mean, they're all on the payroll. They're all on Mayor Daley's payroll. So it's just it's very easy to look. Now, Nixon was toying with the idea of ordering an investigation into what had happened in 1960. So but what he wanted to do, and this doesn't come out in the film, he wanted somebody else to order an investigation. He thought that he would look bad if Nixon, the losing candidate, demands an inquiry. But he was told that any investigation is just going to take forever, and it's by no means certain that you'll get anywhere with this investigation, that you'll ever be able to prove the theft, and then you will come across as a sore loser. You try to do this, and then, hey, look, you're a sore loser. You lost, and you didn't want to admit that you had lost. Something similar to what Trump had faced, but Trump was just much more of an exuberant personality. He didn't really care that people called him a sore loser, a liar, or whatever. He didn't care. Nixon would have cared. Nixon would have been pained if people were calling him a liar and a sore loser. So he decided not to challenge it. But yeah, I mean, I think that Nixon did want to challenge it for a while. He was just dissuaded from going ahead with it. I mean, I have to say though, Cynthia, apropos of the film, I was very disappointed with it. To be honest, this is the first time I've ever seen the film, and I thought the first third of the film seemed pretty good. It seemed like a fair and a reasonably not unsympathetic portrayal of Nixon. But then when they started throwing in all these conspiracies in which Nixon was supposed to be involved, it really became stupid, because then you say, well, show us some evidence. You're throwing, oh, Nixon was involved in the JFK assassination. Well, what's your evidence for that? How could he? What would have been the mechanics? He was out of power. He had no say in anything. And so but it gives it a whole series, very sinister elements. Well, Nixon with E. Howard Hunt and so on. But again, all these people, like essentially these E. Howard Hunt and others, they had been involved with Cuba, with Bay of Pigs. They were involved in all the various attempts to assassinate Castro. That didn't have anything to do with Nixon. To present this as somehow this was a Nixonian operation, it was just unfair. So they want to present Nixon in this very negative light, that he's the embodiment of evil. He's in this one horrible conspiracy after another. It's just it's very unfair, and so that's why I thought the film was just disappointing, and there was a particular scene that I found very annoying, was when he was on that plane in 1972, coming back from China after the historic visit to China, and then the journalists, they invite Nixon to come and talk to them, and then they give him a standing ovation, and because of this accomplishment in China. And then they have Nixon kind of giving his double victory sign, in the plane. They just made Nixon look ridiculous. I mean, you're not even able to acknowledge, that he was a kind of a historic and visionary statement. They have to make him into this rather sort of pathetic, contemptible fool, giving sort of a double victory sign in a plane with these reporters. So I just found that very annoying. Anyway, thank you so much as always. So Cynthia, thank you so much yesterday for providing so many really fascinating and interesting observations about the film, all kinds of things that we didn't know about the making of the film, and so that was all extremely useful. And that's why I recommend, though again, I didn't like the film, but that's just me, that's my taste. But I recommend people to go and see the film and Nixon by Oliver Stone, and then enjoy all the running commentary from Cynthia. You're going to learn a great deal. So thank you. Anne-Marie, as always, thank you so much for your generosity. Really appreciate that. And I was kind of interested, Anne-Marie, what you thought of Francis Poulenc, the latest music that I'd selected. I just wonder what you think of Poulenc. Anyway, 60 Cents. Good to see you again. Haven't seen you in a while. So since 60 Cents says, a friend on Silicon Valley. So it's nice to have friends in Silicon Valley. So says, greetings, George and fellow Gagglers from Silicon Valley. I heard that near the end of the Clinton administration, when President Clinton was engaged in negotiation with the Palestinians and Israelis, Netanyahu reportedly whispered in Clinton's ear that he had compromising videos of Clinton via Epstein and Lewinsky. Well, I don't know. It's an interesting thing. I mean, it's quite possible that the Israelis, in fact, it's quite likely the Israelis were spying on Clinton. But the thing is that at that time, in Camp David, we're talking about 2000. So whatever information they had on Clinton would have been OTOs. I mean, at time it was null and void because Clinton had already been impeached. He had already been impeached over a very sordid matter. I mean, it was basically he was he had and I wouldn't say it was exactly an affair, but he had sexual relations, as they put it, sexual relations with this intern, and all kinds of really grubby, dirty things that came out in the Kenneth Starr report. We don't have to detail them, but they would be pretty embarrassing for anybody. So I don't know what more by 2000 you could come up with against Clinton. I mean, what else are you going to say? I mean, you already had the stained dress. You'd already had the cigar. You'd already had the talk about the blowjob while he was talking to Yasser Arafat on the phone. I mean, a lot of very, very embarrassing stuff had already come out. So I doubt whether Netanyahu could have had anything more on him, other than, I mean, if there was something really reprehensible, in Clinton's conduct, like pedophilia or whatever. But I don't think that's the case with him. There's no evidence that Clinton was ever particularly into very young girls. I mean, yeah, he was into obviously young women, like Monica Lewinsky, but anything younger than that, there's no evidence Clinton was ever particularly into that. So I don't really buy the idea. I do accept that I think the Israelis were spying on him and knew a lot about his predilections, but I doubt whether any of that had played any role in what happened at Camp David. Anyway, Marty says the Hounds plus tip jar equals a new crosstalk studio, and he presents a photograph of Peter. 2 + 2 = 5. Okay, that's good. That's nice picture. It's a new studio. That looks nice. All right. V Shakopopolis. Okay, that's good. Shakopopolis. So, George, speaking about Nixon, have you seen Altman's Secret Honor? No, I haven't. I have to confess, I haven't. I've always, I'll be honest. That's why I haven't seen the Nixon. This was, the Oliver Stone's film. I am always wary of these Hollywood biopics about political figures, because I know that they're going to be very bad. They're going to hate Nixon. They're going to be very negative about Nixon, and I just think this is really unfair. The other thing is, and I think this is really problematic when we talk about Oliver Stone, is that he, like others, again in Hollywood, tends to mix fact with fiction. So he tends to mix documentary reels with made up scenes. Now, the problem with that is that it confuses people. It confuses audiences, and that's something you really can't do. You can make a documentary about someone, and then we can debate how you present it in the documentary, or you can make an entirely fictional film. You can make a fictional film about a president that would base it on Nixon or base it on Kennedy or whatever, but it's in fiction, and we know we're watching fiction. But what Stone does, and again, I don't know about Robert Altman's film. What Stone does is he kind of mixes fact with fiction, and that I think is reprehensible, because then I think you're confusing audiences who really don't know all the details, don't know all the ins and outs of these characters. You're bringing in so many characters, all the Helms and Hunt and Ehrlichman and so on, and so people will take, okay, well, this is probably what happened, and And I think that really isn't, it's anyone who's seen the great movie The Third Man, which maybe will screen one day, when Mr. Popueshko, I think Popueshko, yeah, Popueshko. Anyway, he confronts Holly Martins at that literary event, and he says, Mr. Martins, you've been doing something very dangerous. Oh, what's that? Oh, mixing fact with fiction. And then he said, well, should I make it all fact, Mr. Popuescu? And I said, no, stick to fiction. And I think that's one. That, of course, that's Graham Greene's line, but I think that's the point. You're doing something very dangerous. You're mixing fact with fiction. And said, well, should I make it all fact? No, stick to fiction. And I think that's why I found this. That was the reason why I kind of avoided seeing Stone's film. Why I never read Bob Woodward's books, because again, he's mixing fact with fiction. Well, why would I want to do that? Why would I want to do it? Because then I don't know what's fact and what's fiction, and I think we all kind of it's imperative that we do distinguish between fact and fiction. Anyway, R. Brown says, the conversation about NATO's war with Russia reminds me of the TV coverage of the Bobby Fischer Boris Spassky World Chess Championship back in 1972. Moves, counter moves, lines of attack. Too bad that this war could get to the point where thousands of nukes on the backfire are released. The outcome then wouldn't be a win, loss, or a draw, where you just tip your king over and shake hands. I guess our human nature allows us to analyze real possibilities as nothing more than abstractions. I agree with that. It's what was interesting about the Fischer Spassky match, because it was a huge event. I mean, it's hard to convey. Today, that was more than 50 years ago. What an extraordinary event that was. I mean, nobody in the world had ever followed a chess championship, world chess championship, in the way that people were following it. And somehow this was America and the Soviet Union, and it was just simply like a twilight struggle between the free world and the Soviet Union. And then, of course, when Bobby Fischer prevailed against Spassky, it was a triumph. It was a triumph for the free world against the communists. It was a triumph for democracy against totalitarianism. And Fischer kind of played into that. And I think he loved he became the celebrity and became the hero. Hey, he's the man who won the Cold War, so to speak. And of course, he was on all the TV shows. He went. Nixon was president. Naturally, he was welcomed in the Oval Office. And of course, the bad guy was Boris Spassky, which was really unfair, because Spassky was just he was the Soviet chess champion. He was a nice guy, decent sort. But he somehow had to carry the burden of the representative of world communism, the representative of totalitarianism. Then it all went very sour for Fischer, because Fischer then refused to defend his title, and then he was eventually stripped of his title. And even that would have been, that was okay. He did that. It's like he reached this zenith. He reached this peak, this moment when he won the title. He had defeated the Russians. The Russians had always held the World Chess Championship. Now the Americans were holding it. So he'd done that. But then he kind of, became, increasingly reclusive. He never tried to win his title back. And then in 1992, the 20-year anniversary of the great Fischer-Spassky contest, they did a replay, Fischer versus Spassky, and they replayed. They met again for the rematch. But it took place in Belgrade, Yugoslavia, and but Yugoslavia was under sanctions. under sanction, obviously by the United States, but it was also under sanction by the United Nations, though cultural context, I think the United Nations didn't touch that. They only dealt with the issue of arms transfers to Bosnia-Herzegovina. But anyway, the Americans, however, did sanction Yugoslavia. So he basically broke the sanction. He broke American sanctions. And he knew he was doing it. He knew that actually that's a crime that he would be prosecuted for in the United States. So he went ahead and he just replayed this match in Belgrade, 1992. Fischer won again, but he couldn't return to the United States anymore, and so he had to really essentially travel around the world, finding different places to live. He couldn't go back to America, and he never did return to the United States after that. He died in Iceland. I think it was 2006. So anyway, and of course the U.S. media had turned violently against him. The same U.S. media that had celebrated him and glorified him, deified him in 1972, the slayer of communism. Now we're constantly writing about that he was crazy. He was a malevolent force, a ridiculous figure, and always denouncing him. And it was kind of really very sad. And of course he turned very much against America. Really became very anti-American. Understandably. I mean, he was basically there was a warrant out for his arrest. So the man who had supposedly won the Cold War for the United States then became this a wandering figure who couldn't return home and who was subjected to constant ridicule and denunciation in the New York Times and the rest of the U.S. media. And so, that's a sad but not unusual Cold War story. So where are we? Oh, yes. So anyway, but thank you so much, R. Brown. Really appreciate your generosity. And then R. Brown says, what do you think will be the signal that a nuclear weapon will be deployed, like everyone in Hollywood going on vacation in New Zealand or the U.S. Congress, visiting the Greenbrier Resort to play golf in December in West Virginia, or an emergency Five Eyes conference in Antarctica? I was kind of thinking about that. What I would think is that that a nuclear weapon may be used in Ukraine, and then they're going to blame this on Russia. They'll say, "Oh, it was Russia that had done this. It was Russia that had launched a nuclear device." Because obviously, once a nuclear device is launched by Ukraine, then everyone knows about it, and then they'll say, "Oh, it was Russia that did it," and Russia will say, "No, we didn't do it. It was Ukraine did it." But of course, the media will accept that. Of course, it was Russia that had fired a nuclear weapon. So I think, when will we know? We'll know when the media start telling us that Russia has used a nuclear weapon in Ukraine. When they tell you Russia used a nuclear weapon, then that was it. That Ukraine has used a nuclear weapon provided by the United States. So that's how I think it's going to turn out. And then we have Marty. Marty's always he's so good at digging up these fascinating cultural references. Just like when I say, "Oh, there was a Monty Python episode," boom, within 5 minutes, Martin has already dug up the Monty Python episode I was thinking of. So Marty has posted that picture of Henry Kissinger. Was it a Time magazine or Newsweek? Oh, it was a Newsweek cover June the 10th, 1974, it's Super K. And there he is. He's wearing the Superman costume, and it's Super K. Now, keep in mind, Kissinger, of course, loved this kind of thing. But June 1974 was just 2 months before Nixon's resignation. So Nixon was, of course, a totally kind of reviled figure. The media, always just dumping on him. Particularly now, he was fatally weakened. It looked increasingly unlikely that he would survive to finish his term. But nonetheless, they idolized Kissinger. Kissinger, who was really, he's Nixon's national security advisor, he's Nixon's Secretary of State. So they worship Kissinger. They suggested it was somehow everything that was happening, this whole Super K was all about the disengagement agreement that had been negotiated between Israel and Egypt, between Israel and Syria. That's after the Yom Kippur War. It's taken a long time, but they finally negotiated a disengagement agreement. And they went absolutely crazy. Oh, Super K, he did all this, but it's the administration. It's Nixon who was the president. It was Nixon who had presided over this disengagement agreement. No, it's just all Kissinger. He's just doing this thing like that. He's just running foreign policy. While Nixon is just sinking hopelessly without trace. Kissinger is running foreign policy. I mean, it's so stupid. But that was, that's your U.S. media. U.S. media then was as stupid as it is now. Just Super K, and of course, you can even see in that picture just how pleased Kissinger is with himself. He loved this idolatry. But pride goes before a fall. Kissinger went into his reputation went into steep decline in subsequent years, and then R. Brown says that it looks like Peter Lavelle with muscles. Anyway, and then apropos of Poulon, Anne-Marie says, my comment about Poulon is awaiting a response. Okay, I missed it, so I will. I'm going to look after this. I'm going to see your comment, and then I will respond. It's my fault that I didn't see your response. So looking forward to reading it, and I will respond. Thank you so much, Anne-Marie. I appreciate that. And then Carlos says, I don't think there's going to be a nuclear war, but rather a forever war, like Orwell described in 1984. No, that's fair enough. I think we're under forever war, particularly when it comes to Ukraine, because the West wants a forever war. It's not suffering any casualties itself, and the Americans can just get others just to fight, get others to kill one another. Hey, the Americans have always been very good at that. Setting people off against one another. So. Why would they want to bring this forever war to an end? What's the incentive for that? So, I agree. But it's a possibility that it could get nasty. As I said, it's not beyond the realm of possibility that there will be I don't know exactly a nuclear war, but it's possible that we'll see the first use of nuclear weapons, or at least as far as we know, first use of nuclear weapons since 1945. Anyway, my time is up. So thank you, everybody who has joined me. Thank you for all your really interesting questions and comments and suggestions. Always very good. I really enjoy it. And thank you above all to those who have put some money into the tip jar, because tomorrow's Wednesday. I have to go, cap in hand, to offer my apologies to these hounds. See if they can express some sympathy for my plight. They never do, but I always think that, well, one day they'll say, yeah, you're doing a good job. but that ain't going to happen. They're never going to say you're doing a good job. But anyway, thank you so much for your contributions. We will be back on Thursday at the same time, and I look forward to seeing you then. Till then, all the best. Good night. Bye-bye.